So in this lecture, I want to just briefly talk about some criticisms of the utilitarian approach, some problems with it. I want to do this as kind of a way of setting up the attractions of the retributivist approach, which we will talk about in the next couple of lectures after this. And I think the problems with the utilitarian approach are the sorts of problems with utilitarianism generally. Basically that it's unfair, at least in some cases. It can be too lax. It can be not harsh enough, but you can also imagine cases where it's too harsh. If you're a utilitarian, you're not talking about what the criminal deserves. You're talking about what will have good consequences. And that seems like it might be a problem. And I'll sketch a little bit more why that is in a second. There's also this idea that utilitarianism, or at least the utilitarian approach, doesn't respect human dignity or freedom. The whole approach doesn't respect humans' ability to act for reasons, to make choices, or the dignity we have because of that. I'll also talk more about that in a second. Well, let's talk about the unfairness. And I think the easiest way to see this is to think about some cases where heavy punishments are not needed for deterrence, or even punishing the crime at all might not be useful. But a light punishment or no punishment seems unfair. I'll give you a few cases. Werner von Braun, Anders Breivik, and Brock Turner. Let me go through these sort of in reverse order. Brock Turner was the infamous Stanford swimmer who sexually assaulted a woman who was passed out. Now Turner goes before the judge, who's since been recalled and is out of a judging job at least. And the judge says, well, Turner is a promising young man. He's at Stanford. He's like this great athlete. Basically, guys like Brock Turner are really unlikely to commit these crimes again, even if they did in the past. There's not going to be much good that comes out of punishing Turner. If I punish him, it's just going to mess his life up. It's probably not going to do a whole lot to prevent sexual assault in the future. So let's give Brock Turner a good hard slap on the wrist. I think he did a few months in jail and that was it, right? Here's the thing, though. Not only do I think that Brock Turner should have been punished way more harshly, all the factors the judge cites as reasons not to punish Brock Turner harshly strike me as reasons to punish him more harshly, right? He's at Stanford. He comes from a well-off background. He has all these prospects. All of this stuff gives guys like Brock Turner less of an excuse for any crimes they might commit, right? Brock Turner is not some kid who suffered horrible abuse and is now, warped because of it. He's not somebody who's had brain damage and has trouble controlling his impulses, right? Brock Turner is more responsible, if anything, for his crimes than a lot of other people that this judge would have thrown the book at, right? Who don't have Brock Turner's promising future. I think he needs to go to jail for a very long time. It is, to me, grossly unfair that Brock Turner gets off light. Even if everything the judge says is true, even if throwing the book at Brock Turner won't have better consequences, even if it will have, worse consequences than treating him very leniently, I think we should throw the book at Brock Turner. He should be in jail, right? The judge is taking a very utilitarian approach here, and maybe there are ways you could say, oh, he's not being a good utilitarian. I don't know. But in the case of Brock Turner, it just seems to me the utilitarian approach misses something, right? It's not about what will have good consequences. It's about what Brock Turner deserves. Or Anders Breivik, an even worse person, right? So if you haven't heard of Breivik, he's basically a neo-Nazi, right? Which is bad enough, right? But Breivik's also a terrorist. He goes to a youth camp for one of the two major political parties in Norway, where he's from, and goes on a shooting rampage, kills 69 unarmed people, right? Now, Norway doesn't have the death penalty. We can argue about the death penalty. We're not going to in this class. There's a lot of issues with it. I guess, there's the issue of executing innocent people, which is always a worry. Some racial bias worries, but neither of these are a factor with Breivik, right? He definitely did it. He is a member of the majority group in Norway. But Norway has no death penalty. Not only that, Norway's maximum sentence for murder is fairly short, right? Anders Breivik is never going to get out, but he will be eligible for parole fairly soon. Not only that, but Norwegian prisons are actually pretty nice places to be, right? Pretty comfortable, pretty nice. Probably a lot of college students live worse in their day-to-day lives than the average Norwegian inmate in a Norwegian prison, right? And now the defense of this, the Norwegians will say, well, we found that even for murder, harsher sentences aren't worth it. We found that when you give people a good environment in prison, they're less likely to reoffend, and all of which I think is probably true. But when I hear about Anders Breivik, it just misses the point. It's like, Anders Breivik, at the very least, should be miserable the rest of his life, right? We can talk about whether we should hang him or not, but at the very minimum, he should have a pretty miserable existence for the rest of his days, right? And there should be no chance that Anders Breivik will ever walk free. Even if you could tell me, oh, we've got some experts who say he's really unlikely to do this again. I don't care, right? Just on the basis of what he's done, to me at least, there seems to be a lot to be said for Anders Breivik should suffer, right? That this light punishment is not fair. It's not fair to his victims, right? All right. So graduating from a neo-Nazi to an actual Nazi, Werner von Braun was the architect of the Nazi rocket program. Not only did he, was he involved with slave labor where people were worked to death, starved to death, he built these rockets the Nazis used to attack civilian targets in London, to kill innocent people, right? Well, at the end of the war, we decided that Werner von Braun was very useful to us because he was actually a really smart guy. We wanted to build a space program. And the other reasoning was also, well, what good will come from hanging Werner von Braun, right? Yes, he's a war criminal. He was involved with Nazi death camps. He was involved with Nazi attacks on innocent civilians in London. But, who's it going to deter if we hang Wernher von Braun, right? And if we let him live, he can help us build these rockets. We'll go into space. That'll have great consequences. Again, good utilitarian reasoning for not hanging Wernher von Braun. I think that's all true. To me, it seems to miss the point. Given what he's done, Wernher von Braun should have hanged with some other Nazis at Nuremberg, right? We shouldn't let Wernher von Braun off because he's useful in a way that other guys aren't. All of that the utilitarian seems to miss. Sorry, this is probably the only group in which Brock Turner could look relatively not terrible. I mean, I guess he still looks terrible, but, as compared to a neo-Nazi and an actual Nazi, at least as horrible a person as he is, he's the least horrible of the lot, right? Anyway, also sorry to result to actual Nazis, Probably shouldn't use Nazis in our argument very often. Tends to bias the issue, but I think it does make this clear, right? Also, even though utilitarians are generally for lighter punishments, we can imagine cases where utilitarians support punishments that are too harsh. Think about so-called 3 strikes laws. If you commit 3 felonies, depending on the state, 3 felonies or 3 violent felonies, you go to jail for life. Now, I don't know what a utilitarian would say about these generally. There's mixed evidence on whether they prevent crime or not. I don't know. But at least in theory, even if we're not sure about the facts, in theory, if we found out, well, certain people are just super likely to reoffend, we'll just send them to jail now to prevent future crime. If that were the case, in theory, utilitarianism could support sending those people to jail. That seems wrong to me. Look, if you commit a fairly minor crime, stealing a few $1,000s, even if we can predict with 100% certainty, given your psychological profile, you will do it again at some point, sending you to jail for the rest of your life for a minor theft just seems wrong, right? That seems unfair, even if it would prevent future crime. In another way, utilitarianism might be too harsh. So-called strict liability isn't ruled out. Well, what does strict liability mean? Strict liability means even if the crime was completely out of your hands, even if you didn't have a choice, you can still be charged for it, right? In criminal law, the most common forms of strict liability are statutory rape and so-called felony murder rules, right? Statutory rape, people can be charged with having sex with a minor even if they had every reason to believe the person wasn't a minor. When we get to felony murder, a lot of times if you're involved in a crime and you have nothing to do with the violence, let's say you don't have the gun, but your accomplice kills somebody in the course of the crime, you can also be charged with murder, even though you didn't kill anybody. In both of these cases, the rationale seems to be, well, this thing is so bad that even if the person doesn't have control, we're going to still charge them to prevent the crime. I'm not sure if utilitarians would support that, but again, at least in theory, it wouldn't be ruled out. And here, there does seem to be something unfair with punishing people for things that they seem not to have any control over, right? Finally, the whole attitude of utilitarianism Many people, and this goes for many people in the Hi-Fi Nation episode, and I would count myself in this group too. I tend to sympathize with retributivism, just to be honest, would say that the utilitarian approach has no respect for the human ability for choice and responsibility. We threaten you so you won't commit the crime in the future and to make an example of you to scare other people. Hegel, a successor of Kant's, he worked and he and Kant's life overlapped a bit. They never met each other. Hegel sprang off of Kant's work a little bit and in a lot of ways built on it. And Hegel says this whole utilitarian approach to crime and punishment treats the criminal like a dog. Treats him like a dog that needs to be frightened with a stick. You hold up the stick of criminal punishment so the criminal will be scared and the other criminals will be scared and not do stuff. Well, Hegel will say, how in the world can that respect human dignity? For that reason, Hegel takes this retributivist route, and Kant will too, for similar reasons on the basis of similar worries. So, look, I don't want to be biased. My sympathies kind of do lie with a form of retributivism, so I'm going to be very hard on the utilitarian. But I think it balances out because, to be honest, I think Lamb's sympathies and the people he interviews lies with utilitarianism. Maybe I just see bias here because I'm more of a retributivist and whatever, but I really do think he leans toward utilitarianism. So if I lean a bit toward retributivism, hopefully it'll balance out, right? And let's just, to be honest, you guys have been made aware. My sympathies lie here. You can correct for it in your own ways, right? But the next couple lectures, I do want to talk about retributivism. I think Lamb does a pretty good job covering the basics. There are some ways I think he misrepresents it a lot or might give an idea of it that's not quite right. I do want to correct that.